Hey there, guys, gals, and non-binary pals. We are back with another week of U.S. history, and this week we are going to be starting World War II. And we're going to be discussing the origins of World War II in Europe, the origins of it in the United States, and the origins of it in Asia, because this was truly a world war, and we don't want to belittle that. So, we are going to talk about those three things, the rise of Nazi Germany and stuff. So, without further ado, let's do our introduction. Now, the rise of Nazi Germany under Hitler's leadership, it really challenged the political, settlement that had been reached by the Paris Peace Conference following World War I. On September 1st of 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and 2 days later, Britain and France declared war, beginning World War II in Europe. Now, like the previous global conflict, the vast majority of Americans detested German aggression, and they did not consider Germany to really be a direct threat to them. France at the time had the strongest army in the world, and they had a seemingly impenetrable system of fortifications along the Maginot Line, which was the border between Germany and France. And not only that, but then you had Great Britain, who had the dominance of the oceans with their superior naval power. Not only that, but they also had the resources of an empire. At this point in time, when somebody said the sun never set on the British Empire, that's what they meant. I mean, the British Empire spanned the entire world. So Americans assumed that this conflict would play out very similarly to that of the Great War, that it would be a slow-paced war of attrition, but unfortunately they're going to be sorely mistaken. The assumption was shattered in spring of 1940 when Germany launched a massive invasion of France, and they defeated the French army in less than 40 days. Now, keep in mind, I said that they were the strongest army in the world at the time, or at least that's what we thought. It became clear at that moment that the war that we were about to fight was going to be fought on a far larger scale than World War I. In many respects, the Second World War is simply a continuation of the First World War. It's kind of like World War II or World War I Part 2 or the sequel or whatever. And that's because the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, it might have ended hostilities, but it didn't actually resolve any of the underlying conflicts. So the conflicts of World War I were still around by the time we get to World War II because nothing really had been resolved. So Hitler and his National Socialist Party, they started to stoke the feeling of resentment that was among the German middle classes. And the German middle class really suffered economically and psychologically in the wake of World War I. They were hit the hardest. And so Hitler rode this resentment to power in 1933. And it wasn't super easy for him, but we aren't here to discuss everything about Hitler. So if you want to know more about how he came to power, there's a YouTube video here for you that you can watch. It's only like 5 minutes or so, so it's pretty simple and it's kind of interesting. So yeah, he rode that power in 19 he rode that resentment to power in 1933. Now he started his kind of campaign to reunify Germany and to establish, German superiority in in 1936. And the way that he does this is he does this with the reoccupation of a territory called the Rhineland. It's here on your map. It's that dark green area that sits in between France and Germany. And he, in March of 1936, he marches right into the Rhineland and he demands that the British and the French forces withdraw from the area. And they do. They completely withdraw because both Britain and France were pretty determined to avoid another conflict. World War I is still fresh in everybody's mind. And to be honest, the French and the British are democracies, right? They're republics, which means that they hold elections, they have elected officials, and because of that, elected officials can't possibly be like, we should probably stop Germany from doing this, and so instead they just go, okay, that's fine, just take it and we'll be on our merry way. 2 years after that, in March of 1938, Hitler negotiates something called the Anschluss, and this is between Germany and Austria. Now, negotiations are in air quotes because it wasn't necessarily a negotiation. It was more like Hitler went to the Austrian, like, prime minister or whatever he was, and he basically said, hey, listen, you're going to give me power of Austria and become a part of Germany, or I'm going to kill you and all of your family and replace you with somebody who will. And the Austrian, prime minister, president, whatever he was like, yeah, okay, where do I sign? So the Anschluss was really forced. Now, that's not to say that the Austrians didn't necessarily welcome the Anschluss. There were several who believed that they could benefit from German protection, but there were a lot of notable exceptions. So this move, when he takes Austria, he claims to the rest of the world that it's not aggressive and it's not expansionist, but that it's a legality of a cultural reality. He claims that the Austrians and the Germans are one people. Okay, so Hitler firmly believes that Austria and Germany are one people. Now, ethnically speaking, they are. Okay, but culturally speaking, they are different. But, Hitler's like, they're German speaking peoples, therefore they should be under the German flag. That's how he looks at it. And so, yeah, there were some Austrians who did like the idea of being under Germany. But of course, there are exceptions like the Jews who, it became quite clear very quickly that the Nazis were a threat to them. Since one, they didn't consider them German, and that two, they considered them to be an inferior race whose influence had been too much, and therefore it should be curbed, if not completely and totally eliminated. So yeah, I mean, like, and then there were just some regular Austrians who did not like the idea of becoming a part of Germany because of nationalism. They felt that they were their own country, and I mean, they really are. They're their own people. They have, their own culture, but ethnically speaking, they are Germans. So 6 months after Hitler announces the Anschluss, he actually met with the leaders of France and Great Britain and Italy in Munich because everybody was a little afraid that Germany was, getting a little too expansionist. And here, Hitler basically promises that his goals are limited. The thing that he wanted to do was bring German-speaking peoples under German control. Okay, and once he had achieved that, he would forgo any other further expansion. Now, it is notable to say that this is a lie. Now, of course, the other leaders didn't know this was a lie. Hitler absolutely wanted to conquer the world. It's in his manifesto called Mein Kampf. And yeah, I mean, like, I don't recommend that you go buy it and read it because that just, is giving money to Nazis. But in Mein Kampf, he does essentially say that he wants to rule the world, and that's his goal. And so, I mean, like, no, he absolutely had expansionist ideologies in mind. But the big question is, or at least one of the ones that we ask ourselves today is, why in the world did two of the strongest powers, militarily speaking, appease Hitler? And the governments of France and England, they chose to appease Hitler not necessarily because they believed his word that he wasn't being expansionists, but because they knew that, to be honest, neither one of them were really in a position to defeat the Germans in war. One, it is going to become clear. Okay, now this is something that in hindsight we see, right? The first thing is that the Germans were stronger militarily. We're going to find that out when they invade France and defeat the strongest army that the world thought was the strongest army in 40 days. But secondly, the main thing that France and England know, because they don't know that Germany is stronger than them militarily, they know that public opinion is anti-war, that they simply can't go to war with Germany and they can't defeat Germany without, the support of the people. So since public opinion is so anti-war, any attempts for them to mobilize for a potential war was really going to, get those parties voted out of office. And they wanted to stay in office, either because they liked the power or because they felt they were the best person for the job, but we'll never really know. But appeasement, the person who becomes the face of it is the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. And history is not going to be kind to him because of this. Many are going to later accuse him of being a coward, of being naive in his belief that, Hitler really was going to stop, mobilizing and taking all this territory. But realistically, Chamberlain's policies were not only realistic, but they were also less cowardly than a lot of his critics probably claimed. Signing the Munich Agreement and therefore appeasing Hitler, Chamberlain believed, quote, that he was buying time for the British to mobilize. So he didn't necessarily Or at least we believe as historians that he didn't necessarily believe wholeheartedly that Hitler was just going to stop. But he thought that he was buying time for Great Britain to mobilize, to get used to the idea that they are going to have to face the Germans on the battlefield. And that the British, needed to be eased into that in order to have the better, the best chance for success on the battlefield. Now, less than a month after the Munich Agreement, Hitler obviously breaks his promise. He forces himself into the Sudetenland. If you look back at the map that we were just on, the Sudetenland is over by Czechoslovakia, and it's a region in Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic, in that country that is predominantly German-speaking people. And not all of the region is German speakers, but most of the region, the majority of the region, are German speakers. So Hitler's like, I'm going to take this because, I just want to put German-speaking peoples under the German flag. And that's how he justifies it. And Hitler was basically positioning himself to take over the entire country of Czechoslovakia. And the Czechs really saw the writing on the wall, and they start desperately trying to appeal to Great Britain and France to protect them. Of course, they get no response, because at the end of the day, Britain and France are like, well, as long as Hitler's not looking at us, we're going to be fine. Now, all the while, Stalin is hanging out over in the Soviet Union, and he's watching all of these events unfold. He starts to urge the Western governments to join the Soviet Union in pursuing what he calls a policy of collective security. And this collective security is in opposition of Hitler. And that's because everybody's a little afraid of Hitler. And Britain and France, they basically show pretty little interest in Stalin's strategy. They're like, no, we don't really want to be friends with the Soviet Union. And a big reason why is because, well, they're republics, and the Soviet Union is a communist country, and communism is the great bad guy of capitalism. And so they were like, nah, thank you, but no, thank you. And Stalin essentially concludes that the reason why they wouldn't join him is because it would look like an outward exclamation of war, right? And so he believes that the Western governments are weak and that they're going to do anything and everything that they can do to stop Hitler from invading themselves by turning, here Hitler, you look elsewhere. So he also, because Stalin, he thinks like all capitalists are terrible people, and he suspects that he's being set up by the capitalist countries, that by appeasing the German leader, essentially what the West is doing is making Hitler cast his eyes towards the East, right? And so therefore the West is indirectly urging Hitler to attack the Soviet Union. And this is something that Stalin totally believes. And that's not too far-fetched, because again, as long as, Hitler is preoccupied with somebody other than them, then they don't have to go to war. So, I mean, Stalin's kind of not that far off. By mid-1939, Stalin abandons his efforts to, get the West to join him in collective security, and instead he starts looking for other options. What are these other options? Well, I'm glad you asked. See, Hitler is laying out his plans, and he's determined this go-around to not fight a two-front war. He believes that that's why they lost World War I, is that they were fighting both Soviet Russia, well, not Soviet Russia at the time, they were fighting Russia, and they were also fighting, the French and the British, and they had too many fronts going on, and therefore, that's why they lost. So he indicates that, he has a willingness to sign some sort of non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union to stop them from trying to invade him. Now, despite the fact that the Soviet Union had been ardently anti-Nazi in its rhetoric, because they think that fascists are stupid, because, and fascists are anti-communist, Hitler is also ardently anti-communist in his rhetoric, so they don't like each other. But they decide that they're going to put aside their ideological differences for military and strategic considerations. So the Germans and the Russians signed the Nazi-Soviet Pact in August of 1939. Now, what this agreement does is it basically says, hey, listen, whatever you're going to do, we're not going to attack you, and vice versa. And so the Nazis and the Soviets are basically agreeing to turn a blind eye to one another. Not only that, but Soviet Russia wants part of Poland, and Germany wants part of Poland, because Poland's pretty rich in nutrients and, has a lot of natural resources. And yeah, so Hitler's like, okay, let's carve up Poland together. So this agreement immediately puts Poland in jeopardy. Not only that, but the French and the German governments announced that if Germany actually attacks Poland, then, they're going to declare war on Germany. Of course, Germany is not intimidated, and Hitler's armies invade Poland on September 1st, 1939, because up until this point, every time the West goes, don't do that, or else they don't actually do anything. And so Hitler's like, yeah, sure, you're gonna finally declare war on me. Now, of course, they do actually declare war on Hitler on September 1st of 1939 when he invades Poland. But as soon as he conquers the western half of Poland and he's ensured that the Soviets are actually not going to move against German forces in the east, Hitler turns his attention to the west, as planned. In 1940, his troops rapidly defeat the armed forces of Belgium. Then he moves into the Netherlands and defeats them. He defeats Norway, and he moves into Luxembourg and defeats them too. The next country in his path is France, and France is going to fall in June of 1940. Now, the world sees these grim images of Nazi troops marching down Paris's Champs-Élysées and Hitler standing in front of the Eiffel Tower, and everyone is completely and totally shocked. The French army had, a substantial and a well-equipped army. So the French, to be defeated at the hands of the Nazis, came as a complete and total great shock to the rest of the world, and especially how quickly it occurred. Less than 40 days. And the world is just like, oh my gosh, Hitler means business. Now, Hitler, pressing his advantage, starts beginning aerial bombardments of British cities, especially London. The Brits, however, they vow to fight on. And even if they're the only ones standing in between Hitler and domination of the West, then, that's fine. Now, Queen Elizabeth, the mother of the current Queen of England, she announces that her children are going to stay with her and that she will, stay with the king. And the king says that, we will never leave London. We're here with the people. And Churchill, who was the prime minister at the time, he speaks to the nation from the underground on the radio, where he gives his famous "We will never surrender" speech. And yeah, that's the English are like, no way, we're not giving up. And the British Royal Air Force, they outfought the German Luftwaffe, and Hitler, paused his attack because the Royal Air Force was just simply outflying and outdoing the German Luftwaffe. And soon enough, Hitler was like, man, we're taking a lot of damage and we're not inflicting enough damage, to the Brits. And so he pauses his attack, and the Germans come very, very close to knocking out Britain, but they don't get close enough, okay? They don't actually ever deliver that knockout blow to the British. Instead, at this point, Hitler makes two of the first two colossal blunders that are going to ultimately lose him the war. Now, this is obviously hindsight, right? So we are looking back going, this is where Hitler starts to lose the war. Now, rather than continuing to focus on defeating the British, he assumes that they're so close to defeat that he can finish them off later. So instead of focusing on the British, he mobilizes his forces to attack the Soviet Union, who he has a pact with, remember. So he could take his sweet time knocking out Great Britain if he wanted to, and then he would have the might of all of his forces fighting against the Soviet Union, because there would be nothing coming from the West at all. Now, again, this is the first of two big colossal blunders. Now, Churchill and the US president at the time, whose name was Franklin D. Roosevelt, they warned Stalin that the Germans are preparing to invade his country. They either do this, from intercepting letters, but, they also have spy planes and stuff like that, so they can see the movement of the German troops. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to yawn there. Okay, so yeah, they were like, hey, Stalin, Hitler's on his way to invade you. But Stalin's like, yeah, whatever. He's wary of the deceptive ways of capitalists and imperialists. So he ignores their warnings until it's too late. On June 22nd of 1941, German troops cross into Soviet territory. And the Soviets are so underprepared and ill-equipped that Soviet troops are simply no match for the heavily armored, mechanized German tank divisions. The Soviets, some fighting with broomsticks, were mercilessly slaughtered. Wave after wave of Soviet infantry are going to be thrown at the advancing German line. And over the next 2 years, the Germans are going to march relentlessly across Soviet territory. Those Soviet troops who do try to retreat are shot down by the Soviet secret police, the NKVD. By the end of the war, the NKVD are going to have killed 1 million Soviet citizens who tried to flee the German advances. And overall, the Soviets are going to lose more than 20 million people in this conflict. But now it's time to talk about the role of the United States. What's going on with the US, right? We've talked about how the war develops in Europe, and now we're going to talk about how the war develops here. Now, gosh, sorry, I'm yawning again. Now, since the Munich Agreement in 1938, so we're backtracking a little bit, President Roosevelt, he suspected that the approaching conflict in Europe was going to likely draw the United States into it. And he couldn't say so publicly because public opinion was adamantly opposed to our nation being involved in yet another European war. Now, Roosevelt, however, recognizes long before most Americans that Nazi Germany is a threat to the United States, even if that threat right now is just to national interests. Now, if Hitler were to gain control of the entire European continent and then neutralize the British Navy, or even worse, put the British Navy in service of Germany, then the United States would be cut off from one of its main trading partners, and would be vulnerable to transatlantic attacks. That would make it very easy for Germany to just, pop on over here and invade us too. And this, so Germany, they represented an economic threat, and they did represent a military threat, but the military threat is much further away in the eyes of the American people. Now, though Roosevelt would have liked to begin mobilizing the United States for war during 1938, he knew that this was politically impossible. Once he decided to run for a third term in 1940, he realized that he couldn't give any indication that he believed that a war with Germany was inevitable, because the people didn't want to hear that we were going to have to go to war with Germany. And so instead, he repeatedly assures the American public, he lies. He lies to the American public and says under no circumstances are our boys going to be fighting in any foreign wars. He literally runs on a campaign of saying, no, we're going to stay out of this war. Now, he later does say that he knew that this was a lie, but that it was a lie that the public needed to hear. And therefore, it was a lie that needed to be told because he needed to be reelected, because he was the best man for the job. That's how he justified this lie to the American public. Now, once he was safely reelected in November of 1940, Roosevelt could afford to be a little more honest with people, and he starts to try and educate them on the events of Europe and what's going on over there, and to make a case, for why the United States needs to support Great Britain, why that was necessary. Now, Roosevelt also insisted that only by helping the British to defeat the Nazis could the United States actually avoid being drawn into the war itself. Those who supported the president's views became known as interventionalists, right? People who want to intervene in the war. Now, still, Roosevelt faced a lot of opposition from non-interventionists, people who did not want to interfere in the war, who claimed that if Germany actually did pose such a threat, significant threat to the United States, as Roosevelt claimed, then U.S. policy should, be thrown. We should take all of our available resources and start defending our own nation's coastline from a possible German attack. And that sending, any military supplies to Britain was unwise, since the United States would need more supplies for its own defenses. Moreover, if Germany defeated Britain, which seemed very likely in 1940 and early 41, then those supplies that we had sent to Britain would fall into German hands. It could, be used against the United States. So what was the point in helping Great Britain is kind of how the non-interventionalists looked at things. Now, many Americans found the non-interventionalists' arguments to be more persuasive, so Roosevelt had to develop a more compelling case for his views, and he did so through fireside chats. Now, his fireside chats were when he came into the homes of people via the radio, and everyone would gather around the radio system and they would listen to the president talk. And one of the things that he talked about in his fireside chats was a policy of something called the Lend-Lease program. Now, Great Britain needed supplies. They needed ships, oil, food, ammunition. especially if they were going to continue to fight against the Germans. Now, Roosevelt proposed that lending the British these supplies in exchange for leases on their military bases would enable the United States to station its troops and its ships in British ports, and therefore we could, you know, what is it? We could, like convey, we could project, that's it. We could project our own power by using, British ports. So that was what it was, right? So the British aren't giving us money because they don't have any at this point. So what we're going to do is we're going to lend them the stuff that they need. And instead of giving us money, the British are going to allow us to use all of their military bases across the world. So that way, it seems like a pretty fair deal. Now, that way, the United States wasn't necessarily joining the war, right? But, it was doing what it could do to ensure that the Germans didn't defeat the British. And if the war came to the United States, then it could actually project its power by making use of those military bases that were being leased from Great Britain. So it was a win-win. It appeased both sides. It basically said, listen, this way we can prepare for war, because we can use British naval ports wherever we needed to across Europe and across the world, because, the British Empire is huge at this point. And that way we're, lending them these things. In return, we get their military ports. So yeah, and that way we could project our power by making use of these military bases. Now, as Roosevelt often did, he explained this policy to the people in a story that was taken from everyday life. And he essentially said this: if your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't keep your hose from him. You lend him the hose so that he can put out the fire before it spreads to your house. And that's the way that he explained the Lend-Lease program to people. This argument began to make inroads in 1941, and Congress does eventually pass the Lend-Lease legislation in March of 1941. And even so, it became clear to Roosevelt that the nation was still ardently opposed, to any U.S. declaration of war on Germany. But this was a good start. Now we're going to talk about how the war develops in Asia, and that's because we talked about what's going on in the United States right up until March of 1941. So we need to talk about the war in Asia and how Pearl Harbor comes to be a thing. So all the while this is happening, the Japanese Empire had been aggressively expanding, and they had been expanding since 1931. They invaded China, French Indochina, which is modern-day Vietnam, Korea, and a chain of islands that had been colonized by Western powers such as Britain and the Netherlands, etc. Now, the Japanese, they sought to access the natural resources and the raw materials that they needed to fuel their industry and military machine. Duh, because they are an island, right? So they needed natural resources, because when you're an island, you don't typically have a lot of those. And so they had to go elsewhere to find them. And the main thing that they needed was steady access to oil. Now, ironically, a lot of Japan's military and industrial expansion was actually funded by U.S. bankers, who during the 1920s and the 1930s, then the Great Depression, saw Japan as a really lucrative investment. They, paid, and they paid on time. And therefore, American oil companies kept oil flowing steadily to Japan. Now, as the Japanese military began to worry the United States government, the U.S. decided to put a stop to allowing these private U.S. companies to invest in and supply the Japanese military. Now, the main reason why is because Roosevelt realized that Japan was taking a lot of the places that Great Britain owned and used for oil where Great Britain had colonized and where they got their supply of oil. And so, yeah, he was like, hey, listen, U.S. companies, you can't supply Japan anymore because they're, hurting the war effort. By 1940, Roosevelt's administration had decided to use access to American oil as kind of like a diplomatic leverage against the Japanese. And basically what the government said is, hey, listen, you're going to stop this, your aggressive and expansionist policies, and we will supply you with oil, but if you don't, then we're going to cut it off. Now, the Japanese tried to reassure the U.S. that, they weren't, expanding just because they wanted to, but that, They wanted to expand because they needed the resources, and that, their aims were limited. They didn't want to like conquer the world. They just, needed stuff to, be a power like everybody else. In 1941, the US severely limited Japanese access to US oil. And of course, this policy does not stop Japanese expansion. And it does the exact opposite of what the US is hoping. They're hoping that the Japanese will go into negotiations with the US and somehow we can stop them from, militarily expanding into these places in the Pacific. And it does not do that. Since the Japanese were unable to rely on US oil, they decide that they're going to find an alternative source that's much closer to home. And they set their sights on conquering the oil-rich Dutch East Indies and other strategic areas that had all been colonized by Britain. Now, Britain gets the bulk of its oil from the Dutch East Indies at this point in time. So Roosevelt feared, that the Brits would end up having to divert military sources from Europe to defend their colonies in Asia. And if this happened, then it would increase Hitler's chances of actually dominating the European continent and cutting off all trade from Europe with the US. So the economic depression in the US, would become more permanent, and then, we would have to become a garrison state because we wouldn't be able to, trade with the people we needed to trade with, and yeah, it was just going to be a bad time. So yeah, the United States said, okay, listen, we're going to step in and we're going to help Great Britain out by saying, hey, listen, Japan, you can't do these things, which is unfortunate for us. All right, so the Japanese military, they considered the United States to be a weak and inferior society to themselves. Now, they were convinced that if they could, suddenly and devastatingly attack the United States military, that the American public would demand that, the United States withdraw from the Pacific. And so what they do is they strategically decide to bomb Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And that way the United States would have to pull out of the Pacific because without Hawaii, we wouldn't be able to, maintain our military forces and our imperialistic hold on Guam or the Philippines or all of those other places in the Pacific. So the Japanese would then have a free hand to expand at will in Asia without any type of fear of the United States launching a military attack on them from the Pacific. So Japanese politicians and even the officer that was put in charge of planning Pearl Harbor, they really did question the wisdom of such a move, whether or not they really wanted to go to war with the United States, because they're not dumb, okay? The Japanese were very intelligent with the way that they managed World War II. Their leaders pointed out that if the Americans, rather than, saying, hey, listen, demanding that they retreat out of the Pacific, if they declared war on Japan in response to the attack on Pearl Harbor, then the Japanese would really struggle against the Americans. And that's because they were fully aware that the United States' economy is exceptionally larger than that of Japan's. Japan is an island, the United States is a continent, right? And so they were completely and totally aware that if they did not defeat the United States quickly, that they weren't going to defeat the US at all. And the Japanese said, we have to defeat them something like by mid-1942. And if we haven't done that, then it becomes a war of attrition. And they knew that they weren't going to be able to defeat the United States, but that they were going to take as many people as they possibly could with them and hopefully sue for some kind of peace with the US. So that way they weren't technically, losing. They weren't losers. Now, on the other hand, American officials also succumbed to racist notions, about the Japanese, considering them an inferior race to us, and they, they believed that they would never summon the courage or know how to project their military power all the way to Pearl Harbor, and therefore it left the United States' military base completely wide open for attack. They believed that they would be able to see any type of attack from the Japanese because they believed that because the Japanese had squinty eyes, for lack of a better word, that they wouldn't be able to fly at night, that they had night blindness. And so like those are the type of racist notions that everyone was giving into in the, United States. So what we did is we lined up our planes wing to wing on the airfield. We set our ships side by side in the harbor. And that's because the Americans believed that a full-scale attack was just something that wasn't going to happen. That sabotage was something that we needed to really worry about, not a full-scale attack, because there's no way the Japanese would ever be able to attack us. And as a result, when the Japanese attack on December 7th, 1941 came, well, the US military was taken entirely by surprise, and the US Navy suffered considerable losses. However, the Japanese hardly achieved their goal at Pearl Harbor. The United States obviously did not retreat. Instead, we declared war, and the fear of many Japanese politicians were going to be proved correct. And they had to defeat the United States quickly, or they weren't going to defeat the United States at all. Now, the attack on Pearl Harbor brought the U.S. into World War II, um, but not in the way that Roosevelt really wanted, right? He knew that the real danger was losing the war in Europe and that the United States really needed to pursue a Europe first strategy. But Pearl Harbor, after it happened, most Americans really fixated on achieving revenge against the Japanese. So the Europe first strategy that Roosevelt wanted to do was going to be really tough to sell to the American people because Europe didn't do anything to us. And lucky for Roosevelt, and I do mean that he was indeed the luckiest of politicians, Hitler handed him a glorious gift. On December 11th, just a few days after Pearl Harbor happened, 1941, Germany declares war on the United States. Now, why Germany declares war on the United States is still an unknown mystery. Now, here's the thing. There was a treaty between Japan and Hitler, but that treaty never said that Germany had any obligation to ally themselves with Japan if they were to go to war with the US. You remember at the beginning of the lecture when I said that, Hitler made the first of two colossal blunders? The first one being that he didn't actually spend the time to knock Great Britain out of the war. Well, this is the second one. He could have let the United States simply fight a war in the Pacific, and he could have had free reign in Europe without us ever getting over there, right? Because our war was in the Pacific, it wasn't in Europe. And Hitler then decides to declare war on the United States, and and this is the second colossal blunder that he makes. He brings the United States into the war. And this decision was Hitler's second, huge mistake that he made. Remember that, he again, he could have just left us alone and we would have just fought in the Pacific. So Hitler's declaration of war enabled Roosevelt to make a very convincing case that, to the public that winning the war in Europe was just as important as winning the war in the Pacific. So the United States then mobilizes its armed forces to fight a two-front war. Although Roosevelt had done what he could do to pursue a campaign of preparedness between 1938 and 41, the public opinion, on war was, so negative that it limited his efforts. So when we do declare war in 41, the Army is ill-equipped, the soldiers are poorly trained, the Navy lacked ships, any available weapons and ammunition fell short of what was needed. So in order to beat fascism, the United States is going to mobilize, but not just militarily, economically, and socially as well. Okay, scholars, so that's going to wrap up World War II Part 1. Now next week we're going to be talking about World War II kind of on the home front. So in the United States, how it socially changed the U.S., economically changed the U.S., etc. If you have any questions or concerns, make sure that you give me a call, or you can email me, or you can text me. Until then, I will see you all later.